I can't imagine what that must have been like to hear that Otis
Well,
had gone, you know.
he is the only singer that I ever had to open their mouth and say something that made the hair on my arm stand up.
Just in my bones, this loneliness won't leave me alone.
Steve Cropper, a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame who lived and performed in Nashville several times, has died.
December 3rd, 2025, Steve Cropper died with a secret so devastating, so carefully guarded, that he waited 58 years to finally speak it out loud. And when he did, in a dimly lit room in 2019, surrounded by fellow musicians who thought they knew the whole story, what he revealed about Otis Redding's final moments shattered everything the world believed about that tragic December day in 1967. This isn't just about a plane crash. It's not just about a legendary song. This is about a lie that became truth, a timeline that never made sense, and a confession that Steve Cropper took to his grave, almost. Because what really happened in that studio, weeks before Otis died, changes everything. And the reason Cropper stayed silent for over half a century, that's the part that will haunt you. Let me ask you something. Have you ever heard a voice so powerful that your body physically reacted? Not just goosebumps, not just chills, but something deeper, something that felt like electricity running through your veins. Steve Cropper felt it once, only once. In his entire career working with legends, Wilson Pickett, Sam and Dave, Albert King, some of the greatest voices in soul music history, it only happened one time. The hair on his arms stood straight up. His hands froze on the piano keys. And in that moment, he knew. He absolutely knew. The person singing in front of him was about to change the world. But here's what nobody tells you about that moment. Here's the part of the story that got buried under decades of myth, legend, and carefully constructed narrative. That singer, he wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to audition. He wasn't even supposed to open his mouth. And if one drummer hadn't finally snapped and begged Steve Cropper to just listen for 10 seconds, just 10 seconds to get this annoying kid out of his face, Otis Redding might have driven that van back to Georgia and disappeared into history. But that's not even the secret Steve Cropper was hiding. Nashville, Tennessee, December 3rd, 2025. The news broke quietly, the way Steve Cropper would have wanted it. Peacefully, his family said. No drama, no emergency, just a man slipping away at 84 years old, surrounded by people who loved him. The tributes poured in immediately, guitarists who worshipped him, producers who studied his techniques, singers who owed their careers to his arrangements. Everyone had a story about the Colonel, the quiet genius with the Telecaster, who built the sound of Stax Records note by note. But buried in those tributes, hidden in the comments sections and music forums, a question kept surfacing. A question that had been whispered in recording studios and music history circles for decades. Did he ever tell the truth about Dock of the Bay? Did Cropper finally admit what really happened that night? Does anyone know the real timeline? Because here's what the official story says. Otis Redding recorded sitting on the dock of the bay in late 1967. Weeks later, on December 10th, his plane crashed into a frozen Wisconsin lake. He was 26 years old. The song became his final recording, his goodbye, his masterpiece. Released posthumously, it became the only #1 hit of his career. Tragic, poetic, perfect. Except, it wasn't true. Not entirely. And Steve Cropper knew it. Let me take you back to 2019. Musicians Hall of Fame. Backstage interview. The cameras are rolling, but this isn't a highly produced documentary. It's intimate, raw, just musicians talking to musicians. Steve Cropper is sitting across from the interviewer, relaxed, sharing stories about the old Stax days. He's done 1,000 interviews like this. He knows how to tell the legends. He knows which anecdotes get the best reactions. But then something shifts. The conversation turns to Otis Redding, and you can see it in Cropper's face. Something tightens, something changes. This isn't just another fun studio story. This is different. He starts talking about the plane crash, about Duck Dunn's bass being pulled from the wreckage, about the phone call Duck received from the recovery team. And then Cropper says something that makes everyone in the room go silent. He describes how Duck was too devastated to even want the instrument back, how Duck didn't know what happened to it or where it ended up, how at the Musicians Hall of Fame induction years later, Duck admitted he wished he still had it, but at the time, it was just too much to handle. The interviewer nods, respectful. Everyone knows this story. The tragic crash, the lost instrument, the grief that never fully heals. But then Cropper keeps talking. And what comes next? What he's about to reveal. will rewrite everything you thought you knew about Otis Redding's final recording. But before we get to that confession, you need to understand how Otis Redding even got into that studio in the first place. Because this part of the story, it's even more unbelievable than you think. It's 1962. Stax Records in Memphis. The building that would become legendary was still just a converted movie theater in a neighborhood most white folks avoided. But inside those walls, something revolutionary was happening. Black and white musicians working together, not as some political statement, not as some forced integration experiment, just as musicians, as equals, as brothers creating something the world had never heard before. Steve Cropper was already a rising star. His band, the Marquis, had scored a national hit with Last Night in 1961. He was young, talented, and had earned his place as the go-to guitarist at Stax. When artists came through those doors, they wanted Cropper on their sessions. On this particular day, a Tuesday, middle of the week, nothing special scheduled. A regional act called Johnny Jenkins and the Pine Toppers was booked for a session. Jenkins had one minor hit, Love Twist, a dance number that caught fire locally but never broke through nationally. Now he was back, desperate for a follow-up. Stax co-founder Jim Stewart was giving him another shot. The band set up, instruments were tuned, tape was loaded, everything was professional and routine. Except for one problem. There was this kid, this tall, intense, won't-shut-up kid hanging around the session, loading equipment, moving amps, getting in the way. His name was Otis Redding. He was 21 years old, and technically he was just the driver. Here's what nobody tells you about that day. Otis Redding drove Johnny Jenkins to Memphis because Jenkins didn't have a license. Otis wasn't the star. He wasn't even a featured member of the band. He was Muscle, Help, the guy who made sure the van didn't break down on the highway. But Otis had a secret of his own. He knew, deep in his soul, with absolute unshakable certainty, that he was better than everyone in that studio. Better than Johnny Jenkins. Better than anyone they'd recorded that year. Maybe better than anyone they'd ever record. The only problem? Nobody else knew it yet. So all day long, between takes, during breaks, every single chance he got, Otis pestered the band. He kept asking to sing something, just one song, just a chance to show what he had. Al Jackson Jr., the drummer, one of the most patient professional musicians in the business, tried to ignore him at first, then tried to brush him off politely, then tried to shut him down firmly. Jackson told him that Cropper only held auditions on Saturdays. This was Tuesday. He wasn't getting a session today. But Otis wouldn't stop. He kept asking, kept insisting, kept pushing. Jackson told him repeatedly to stop bugging them during the session. But Otis Redding didn't stop, because he couldn't. Because he knew that if he got back in that van without someone hearing his voice, he might never get another chance. And then, late in the afternoon, something incredible happened. The Johnny Jenkins session was dying. Everyone could feel it. The takes were flat. The energy was wrong. Nothing was clicking. Jim Stewart finally called it from the control room. They decided to pack it up and try again tomorrow. Instruments went into cases. Amps got unplugged. The session musicians started heading for the door, ready to go home, eat dinner, maybe catch a night gig somewhere in Memphis. That's when Al Jackson, frustrated and exhausted, walked over to Steve Cropper. Jackson mentioned that Otis had been bothering him all day long. Cropper glanced over, saw Otis standing there, still hovering, still hoping. Jackson asked if Cropper could just take 10 seconds and listen to the kid, just to get him off his back. Cropper looked at his watch, looked at Otis, looked back at Al Jackson, one of his closest friends and musical partners. He agreed, told Jackson to send Otis over. Those 10 seconds were about to change music history. But here's what you need to understand. This audition almost didn't happen. If Jim Stewart had called it 5 minutes earlier, Otis would have left. If Al Jackson had been just a little more patient, Cropper never would have listened. If Cropper had said he was too tired, Otis Redding would have climbed back into that van and driven home to Georgia, and the world would have never heard his voice. Otis walked over to the piano. Steve Cropper sat down on the bench, resigned to giving this persistent kid his 10 seconds. Cropper told him to play something he wanted. Otis looked at the piano keys, then back at Cropper. He admitted he didn't play piano. Cropper was confused, asked if he played guitar then. Otis said he played a little guitar, but not piano. Cropper could feel his patience thinning. This was going nowhere. He asked if Otis could at least give him some church chords, something to follow. Otis shook his head, said again that he didn't play piano. Cropper almost stood up, almost ended it right there. But something maybe curiosity, maybe just his professionalism, made him try one more time. He asked if Otis meant something like what he was about to play, started a simple 6/8 gospel progression. Triplets, the kind of rhythm you'd hear in any Southern church on Sunday morning. And then Otis Redding opened his mouth. And everything changed. What happened next is something Steve Cropper would describe dozens of times over the next 6 decades, in interviews, in documentaries, in private conversations with fellow musicians, and every single time he'd say the same thing. Otis was the only singer he ever worked with who made the hair on his arms stand up just by opening his mouth and starting to sing. Not Wilson Pickett, not Sam Moore, not any of the legendary voices he'd worked with before or since. Just Otis. Cropper's hands froze on the piano keys. He stopped playing mid-phrase. Just stopped, because his entire body was reacting to what he was hearing. The song was These Arms of Mine. Raw, unpolished. No studio magic, no production tricks, just Otis Redding's voice, pouring out emotion that shouldn't have been possible from a 21-year-old kid who'd never been in a professional studio before. Cropper stopped him, stood up from the piano. Otis asked cautiously if Cropper liked it. Cropper told him he loved it, and then he did something he'd never done before in his entire career at Stax. He ran, sprinted across the studio floor, burst through the control room door. He shouted for Jim Stewart to get out there, said Stewart had to hear this guy sing. Jim Stewart came down from the control room. The other musicians who were halfway out the door stopped and turned around. Something in Cropper's voice told them this wasn't a normal audition. This was something else. Otis sang it again. These arms of mine. Same raw emotion. Same undeniable power. Jim Stewart didn't hesitate. He yelled for Duck Dunn to get his bass back out. They had to cut something real quick. The energy in the studio completely shifted. Instruments came back out of cases. Amps got plugged back in. The board got reset. Tape started rolling. And they recorded These Arms of Mine in one take. One single take. Cropper played piano. Johnny Jenkins, the actual artist who was supposed to be recording that day, played guitar. The rhythm section locked in, and Otis sang like his entire future depended on it. Because it did. The next morning, instead of continuing Johnny Jenkins' session, Jim Stewart and Steve Cropper were cutting a B-side for Otis Redding's debut single. Because they both knew this wasn't just a good song. This was a hit. Otis Redding had a record deal with Stax Records. The driver from Georgia, who wasn't supposed to audition, who wasn't even supposed to be in the building, had just become the future of soul music. But that's not the secret Steve Cropper was hiding. Between 1963 and 1966, Otis Redding and Steve Cropper created magic. Hit after hit after hit. I've Been Loving You Too Long. Try a Little Tenderness. Respect, which Otis wrote, and Aretha Franklin made even more famous. They worked constantly, late nights at Stax, long writing sessions. Otis would bring in ideas, raw emotion, melody fragments. Cropper would shape them, arrange them, find the perfect guitar lines to complement that massive voice. They weren't just collaborators, they were brothers, partners in creation. And here's what most people don't realize. Otis was only 26 years old when he died. Think about that. In just 3 years between the ages of 23 and 26, he recorded a legacy that most artists spend entire lifetimes trying to build. 3 years, dozens of iconic songs, a voice that would influence generations. And then, in late 1967, everything accelerated. Otis had just performed at the Monterey Pop Festival. The mostly white, mostly hippie audience had never heard anything like him. He blew them away. Suddenly, crossover success wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. The world was opening up. And Otis knew he needed one more song, one final piece to complete the puzzle. Late one night, after a full day of recording, everyone at Stax was exhausted. The band wanted to go home. The engineers wanted to shut down. Jim Stewart was ready to call it. But outside the studio, Otis's tour bus was idling in the parking lot, engine running. The Barkays, his young, hungry band, were already on board, yelling out the windows. They were calling for Otis to come on, saying they had to go right now or they'd miss the gig. They had a show to get to, miles to drive, a schedule to keep. But Otis wouldn't leave. He called back that he had one more thing to do. He looked at Steve Cropper, exhausted but still standing by his guitar. Otis asked Cropper to do this one last thing real quick. They called in the Memphis Horns. Booker T and the MGs got back into position, tape rolled, and they recorded sitting on the dock of the bay in approximately 10 minutes. If you listen carefully to the original track, you'll notice something strange. Otis sings the same verse multiple times. The lyrics aren't finished. He's improvising, creating in real time, because he literally didn't have time to complete the song. The bus was waiting, the band was screaming, the clock was ticking. But Otis knew. He knew this song was special. He knew he couldn't leave without getting it on tape. So they captured it. One take, rough around the edges, incomplete. And then Otis got on that bus, and they drove off into the night. That was late November 1967. Now here's where it gets complicated. Here's where the timeline starts to blur. Here's where the official story and the real story diverge. And here's where Steve Cropper's secret begins. December 10th, 1967. 2 weeks later, maybe a little more. Otis Redding's private plane took off from Cleveland. Destination, Madison, Wisconsin. A show that night. Another step in a tour that was building momentum towards superstardom. On board, Otis. 4 members of the Bar-Kays, the pilot, 7 people total. The weather was bad. Freezing rain, low visibility. The pilot tried to navigate through it. He didn't make it. The plane crashed into Lake Monona, just a few miles from the Madison airport. Otis Redding was killed instantly. He was 26 years old. 4 members of the Bar-Kays died with him. Jimmy King, Ronnie Caldwell, Phelan Jones, Carl Cunningham. Only trumpeter Ben Cauley survived, pulled from the freezing water, traumatized and barely alive. The news hit Memphis like a bomb. Steve Cropper got the call. So did Duck Dunn. So did everyone at Stax. The grief was immediate and overwhelming. How do you process that kind of loss? How do you make sense of a talent that huge being ripped away at 26 years old? But there was also something else, something practical, something that had to be dealt with immediately. Sitting on the dock of the bay was still sitting on tape at Stax. Unfinished, rough, incomplete. Otis was supposed to come back and finish it, add lyrics, polish the arrangement, complete his vision. But Otis was gone. So the weight fell on Steve Cropper. Here's what Cropper did. He went back into the studio, alone with that tape, alone with Otis's voice, alone with the grief and the responsibility. He listened to what Otis had recorded. He thought about what Otis would have wanted, and then he made choices. He added the sound effects, the waves lapping against the dock, the seagulls crying overhead. He mixed it, he arranged it, he completed it. And in doing so, he turned a rough, unfinished recording into a masterpiece. Sitting on the Dock of the Bay was released in January 1968. It shot to #1 on the charts. Otis Redding's first and only chart-topping hit. Posthumous, tragic, poetic, perfect. And immediately, the story began to solidify. This was Otis's final recording, his last session, his goodbye. Some people even claimed it was prophetic, that Otis knew he was going to die, that the lyrics about watching the ships roll in were somehow his farewell to the world. The mythology grew, the legend became fact, and the timeline blurred into something that felt right, even if it wasn't technically accurate. And Steve Cropper, he never corrected it. Not publicly, not definitively, not for 52 years. Why? That's the question that haunted music historians for decades. Why didn't Cropper just clear it up? Why didn't he say they'd actually recorded it 2 weeks before the crash? Because the truth is complicated. Yes, they recorded it in late November. Yes, the crash happened in December. Yes, there was a gap between the session and Otis's death. But emotionally, spiritually, it was his final recording. It was the last time Otis's voice was captured on tape. It was the last creative thing he did before he died. So when people said it was his final recording, Cropper didn't correct them. Because in every way that mattered, they were right. But there was something else. Something Cropper couldn't quite articulate until 2019. Something about that night, about the bus waiting outside, about Otis refusing to leave until the song was on tape. Something about the urgency in Otis's voice, the desperation, the knowledge, conscious or unconscious, that time was running out. Flash forward to 2019, Steve Cropper is in his late 70s. He's done thousands of interviews, told the stories a million times, but something is different now. Maybe it's age, maybe it's perspective, maybe it's the knowledge that he won't be around forever, and some truths need to be spoken before it's too late. He's sitting with Ronnie Wood and other musicians at the Musicians Hall of Fame. The conversation turns to Otis, to Dock of the Bay, to the crash. And then Cropper says it, out loud, on camera. He reveals that sitting on the Dock of the Bay wasn't actually Otis's final recording. It was recorded a couple of weeks before he died. The room goes quiet. He continues, explains that people think it was the last thing Otis ever did, and in a way he supposes it was. He talks about that night, about the bus waiting, about Otis refusing to leave, about recording it in 10 minutes because that's all the time they had. Cropper describes how they had to rush to get it on tape, how the band was already on the bus, screaming for Otis to hurry up because they were going to miss their gig, how Otis insisted he had to finish the song. He pauses. They did it in about 10 minutes, he says. What Steve Cropper confirmed in that interview wasn't just about dates and timelines. It was about something deeper. Otis Redding didn't record sitting on the dock of the bay as a goodbye. He didn't have some prophetic vision of his own death. He wasn't leaving a final message for the world. He was building, creating, moving forward. He recorded it because he was excited about it, because he knew it was special, because even with a bus full of musicians screaming at him to leave, he couldn't walk away without getting it on tape. That's not the story of a man saying goodbye. That's the story of a man just getting started. And that's what haunted Steve Cropper for 52 years. Not the timeline, not the technicality of when it was recorded versus when Otis died, but the tragedy of knowing that Otis had so much more to give, that he was 26 years old, that he was just hitting his stride, that the world would never hear the hundreds of songs still inside him. Cropper also revealed something else in that interview, something about Duck Dunn's bass. After the crash, recovery teams pulled instruments and belongings from Lake Monona. One of the items they recovered was Duck Dunn's bass. He had loaned it to one of the Bar-Kays for the tour. The call came to Duck from the recovery team. They told him they had his bass. But Duck couldn't handle it. The trauma was too fresh, the grief too raw. Duck told Cropper years later that he was just too devastated to want it back. He didn't know what happened to it, didn't know where it ended up. By the time of the Musicians Hall of Fame induction, Duck admitted he wished he had kept it, but at the time it was simply too much. That bass pulled from the wreckage of a tragedy became another piece of the story that no one quite knew what to do with. Just like the timeline of Dock of the Bay. Just like all the other complicated truths about that terrible December day. December 3rd, 2025, Steve Cropper passed away peacefully in Nashville. He was 84 years old. By the time he died, he had shaped the sound of an entire era, 2 Grammy Awards, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Songwriters Hall of Fame, ranked among the greatest guitarists of all time. But those accolades don't capture what he really was. He was the man who heard greatness in a 21-year-old van driver who wasn't supposed to audition, who felt his hair stand up when Otis opened his mouth, who ran to get Jim Stewart because he knew immediately, instinctively, that something extraordinary was happening. He was the man who completed Sitting on the Dock of the Bay after Otis died, who honored his friend's vision, who carried the weight of that final recording for decades. And he was the man who finally, in 2019, told the truth. Not to diminish the legend, not to take anything away from Otis's legacy, but to honor it properly, to say, this wasn't goodbye, this was a beginning that got cut short. This was a talent so massive that even 10 minutes in a studio with a bus waiting and a band screaming was enough to create immortality. Today, when you listen to Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, you're hearing several things at once. You're hearing Otis Redding's raw, unfinished vocal, the excitement of creation, the urgency of an artist who knows he's onto something special. You're hearing Steve Cropper's completion, the sound effects, the arrangement, the loving final touches from a friend who had to finish what Otis started. And you're hearing the gap between those two moments, the 2 weeks that separated the recording from the tragedy, the space where the truth lived, uncomfortable and complicated. For 52 years, that truth stayed hidden, not because Cropper was lying, but because sometimes the emotional truth matters more than the chronological one. But before he died, Steve Cropper finally spoke it aloud, finally put the pieces together, finally gave us the full story. Otis Redding recorded Sitting on the Dock of the Bay weeks before he died, not hours, not days, weeks. He wasn't saying goodbye, he was saying hello to the next chapter of his career. And that makes the tragedy even more devastating. Because the world didn't lose Otis Redding at the end of his story. We lost him at the very beginning. 2 legends, 1 eternal sound, and a 10-second audition that changed everything. Rest peacefully, Colonel. Your sound shaped our world. Your music shaped our hearts. And your truth, the real truth, will play on for generations,